Hello. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Hey, Carmen. Nice to see you. Oh, you think Hulk's got a smash tonight, huh? Okay. Thanks for sharing. I'll just wait for a minute or two till I see a few more folks arriving either on Facebook or on YouTube. Hi, Dolores. You're in two places at once. And Dolores is sharing to Twitter. Thank you. Ghost Start is here. Breaking 9/11 new. Rashida Tlaib, Democrat, Michigan, calls for an end to the police and the military. Says the U.S. should stop jailing criminals and release all the current prisoners. I got to read that article. I haven't seen it yet. So, okay, I'm going to start us off now. There was news from Scientific American today, written up by Jessica Corbett of Common Dreams. The headline is Scientific American to use, quote, a climate emergency in magazine's future coverage. That is to use the term climate emergency instead of climate crisis, climate change, or whatever alternatives it has been using up until now. Okay, it's adopting a literary convention for Scientific American. After over 175 years of publishing, Scientific American made a major editorial announcement on Monday. The historic U.S. magazine will officially adopt the term, quote, climate emergency, unquote, for its coverage of the human-caused crisis. The move came as part of a new initiative led by Covering Climate Now, a global consortium of media outlets dedicated to improving climate coverage. Scientific American was one of the 9 initial signatories of the climate emergency statement. Common Dreams is a member of the consortium, has signed on to the new statement, and has been using the term climate emergency in our reporting for several years. And here's a tweet from Scientific American. Scientific American has agreed with major news outlets worldwide to start using the term the climate emergency, quote unquote, in its coverage of climate change. Read our statement about this decision and the impact we hope it can have throughout the media landscape. And there is a living picture of the climate emergency. Gee, that is really scary. And so Mark Fischetti, a senior editor at Scientific American, detailed their decision on the outlet's the website on Monday. He wrote, quote, emergency is a serious situation that requires immediate action. When someone calls 911 because they can't breathe, that's an emergency. When someone stumbles on the sidewalk because their chest is pounding, their lips are turning blue, that's an emergency. Those people require help right away. If you multiply those individuals by millions of people who have similar symptoms, and it constitutes the biggest health emergency in a century, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now consider the following scenarios. A hurricane blasts Florida. California dam bursts because floods have piled water high up behind it. The sudden record-setting cold snap cuts power to the entire state of Texas. These are also emergencies that require immediate action. Multiply these situations worldwide, and you have the largest environmental emergency to beset the earth in millennia: climate change. This idea is not a journalistic fancy. We're on solid ground, Fischetti added, citing a climate emergency declaration from over 13,800 global scientists. As Common Dreams previously reported, the declaration initially came in late 2019, but has garnered additional support since, and was spearheaded by William J. Ripple of Oregon State, the university's Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society. Quote, global surface temperature, ocean heat content, extreme weather and its costs, sea level, ocean acidity, and area burned in the United States are all rising, said Ripple at the time. Quote again, all of these rapid changes highlight the urgent need for action. But Ripple and other scientists who launched the effort wrote for Scientific American in January that as we moved into 2021 and beyond, we need a massive scale mobilization to address the climate crisis, including much more progress on the 6 steps of climate change mitigation. They outlined the various priorities for energy, pollutants that are short-lived, nature, food, economy, and population. Fischetti highlighted another pair of lines from the piece by Ripple and his colleagues. The adverse effects of climate change, this is a quote, are much more severe than expected and now threaten both biosphere and humanity. Every effort must be made to restore emissions and increase removal of atmospheric carbon in order to restore the melting Arctic and end the deadly cycle of damage that the current climate is delivering. Echoing the new climate emergency statement, Fischetti concluded that, quote, journalism should reflect what climate says. The climate emergency is here. Scientific American's new policy comes months after another major move. Last September, Scientific American's editors gave President Joe Biden the first ever presidential endorsement in the magazine's long history, warning that, quote, the 2020 election is literally a matter of life and death, unquote. So, one might say, well, who cares what a science magazine has said? And maybe a lot of people don't care. But there are a lot of copies of Scientific American that are sold. There are a lot of people who track things on Scientific American because they're not directly scientists, but they want to keep up with what's happening. And even people who are directly scientists also read Scientific American because, of course, most scientists, the specialists in one thing or another, so it keeps tabs on new findings. They usually go to a generalized sort of publication, and there's none finer than Scientific American, with the possible exception of Science Magazine, um, 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 and also Nature Magazine. But those are probably the top three in science. And there are a lot of people who view this magazine as an authority and as a mediator of social trends. So it is very significant that they now are going to use the climate emergency term when they're talking about the crisis we are beginning to live through. Maybe we have been living through for a number of years now, but still, it seems like it's the beginning, probably because we haven't done very much about it. So let us move on. And we find a piece in the American Prospect, which is by Marsha Brown on April 9th, 2021. Headline is, A New Deal Jobs Program Returns in Biden's Infrastructure Plan. And Dave talks specifically about, I'm sorry, this is Marsha Brown rather than Dave Dayen. I'm so used to looking at Dave Dayen's pieces in the American Prospect. But this is a piece by Marsha Brown. She says, during the Great Depression, President Roosevelt established an alphabet soup, quote unquote, of programs to hire Americans and lift families out of poverty. One of the most popular was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which ran from 1933 to 1942. Over its lifetime, the Corps employed 3 million men, planted 3 billion trees, built 125,000 miles of roads, erected much of our national park infrastructure, and fought forest fires. The program combined improving the environment with putting Americans to work. In Pennsylvania, there were more CCC camps than in any other state, save California. Nearly 100 years later, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, President Biden announced his infrastructure legislation, highlighting plans to fight and prepare for climate change. The American Jobs Plan will lead to a transformational progress in our effort to tackle climate change. With American jobs and American ingenuity, Biden said on March 31st. And it built on a prior executive order by devoting $10 billion to establish a new civilian climate corps. Again, putting people to work on needed conservation and environmental justice projects. The announcement came as the push for investing in a new climate corps was gaining momentum. By Marcy Kaptur, who's a representative from Ohio, a Democrat, introduced a 21st Century Civilian Conservation Corps plan in 2019, saying she was inspired by the impact the 1930s program had on her father, who served in Ohio's CCC. 7 CCC bills representing members of Congress from at least 8 states were introduced just last year, according to a May 2020 Data for Progress poll. More than 70% of voters support the idea. For Representative Joe Neguse, Democrat of Colorado, the need for a climate corps became stark last year when 2 of the 3 largest wildfires in Colorado's history burned in his district. Quote, given my district has been the epicenter for this wildfire activity, given that we know that these fires will become all the more pervasive in the future as a result of climate change, unquote, he said, quote again, it became clear that there is a lot of work to do in these forests. He pointed to fire mitigation efforts and wildlife habitat building as potential tasks for the CCC. Okay. At the time Neguse introduced his version with Senator Ron Wyden, unemployment was in the double digits. But the core, well, real unemployment is still in the double digits. But the core in the 1930s and its 21st century equivalent can do more than just wildfire mitigation. The Red Rocks Amphitheater in Joe Neguse's district was built by 1930s CCC members. Quote, here was this idea that worked so well 90 years ago in addressing a real challenge with respect to economic disruption and the real need to address this crisis of climate change, unquote, he said. In his vision, the new CCC will have temporary, part-time, and full-time positions, and they can also transition to permanent positions in the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and other federal agencies. The new Corps will likely build on existing infrastructure across the country, such as the Colorado Youth Corps Association, which especially focuses on hiring in forestry. The organization, established in 1997, is modeled after the New Deal programs. If Biden's American Jobs Plan passes and new funding juices Conservation Corps across the country, the proponents warn that it must not just fill a gap year for upper middle class white kids, but become an inclusive program focused on job training. We want participants to come in, serve a term or 2 or 3, and then launch into their next career, said Scott Segerstrom, the executive director of CYCA. Quote, we're about workforce development, career readiness for youth, young adults, and military veterans to get training, get professional certification, get all the benefits of serving in a corps, and be well prepared to make the step into a permanent career. CYCA is one of 8 accredited conservation corps in Colorado, which Segerstrom said in a normal year creates about 1,800 jobs for young adults, and for military veterans. The Corps Network is a loose federation of more than 130 corps across the country, where young adults and veterans work on conservation service projects, disaster responses, and more. Terms range in length, but the modern Corps is largely a public-private partnership funded through various nonprofits, unlike the federal program of the 1930s. It's also likely that the new Climate Corps will be built on the Clinton-era AmeriCorps program, which already places people in various locales of the core network. The American Rescue Plan boosted AmeriCorps funding to the tune of $1 billion. That's really small change these days. President Trump's 2020 budget proposed to eliminate the agency that administers the AmeriCorps program. The agency normally operates on a budget of about $1 billion. Biden's $10 billion will be funneled not just through AmeriCorps, but will infuse other service-oriented organizations with resources too. The Corps' proponents wanted to do more than just tackle the rural environmental issues. Senator Dick Durbin has collaborated with Open Lands in Chicago to do urban environmental work, such as brownfield remediation, repairing urban bike and walk trails, as well as planting urban gardens. Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania has pushed something similar in his state to address the loss of tree canopy in cities. All of these proposals echo a more comprehensive plan which the progressives have pushed, the Green New Deal. But the union of job creation and climate work may end up taking different forms in Biden's presidency, given the Corps' mission of both green energy-focused work and forest fire prevention. It reflects the stark reality. Government measures addressing climate change must include remediation to slow or reverse climate change. But they must also prepare for the inevitable natural disasters of an already changed climate. Biden's touting of the Climate Corps, a program that will do both, reflects this understanding. But the modest scope of the program has some climate activists concerned. We absolutely don't think $10 billion is enough, said Sunrise Movement press secretary Ellen Cialis in a statement. Quote, the plan Biden rolled out would create about 10 to 20,000 jobs in a civilian climate corps. When FDR rolled out a similar civilian conservation corps, it employed around 300,000 people per year, or about 15 times more, I should add, than this civilian the Climate Corps. Well, if it had 15 times the budget, it could probably do 300,000 people per year. That would amount, though, to 150 billion per year, and to 1.5 trillion over 10 years. So that's the kind of budget that you need over 10 years. I do have to just check one thing. I may be speaking too soon or expanding this too much. That may be Biden's $10 billion over 10 years, in which case that figure of 300,000 people could probably be done for 150 billion over 10 years, which would certainly be a very small price to pay. So to continue, and that was back when the U.S. population was 40% of its current size. An environmental economist by the name of Mark Paul with the New College of Florida said to Wired that scaled to today's population, the CCC should have roughly 1.5 million workers at its largest size, and perhaps upwards of 9 million workers over the duration of the program. So we are talking then major expenditures if we're going to have 9 million workers over the duration of the program. And we're talking about 900,000 workers per year. And so that takes things up to 450 billion over 10 years, or 45 billion a year. So on the average, but much more actually front loaded. So we're talking much more money than Biden has budgeted for this. Chaz Robles, Ancestral Lands Director for the Conservation Legacy, says 10 billion is a great investment towards addressing the needs of our environment, economic development, and the priorities of indigenous communities. But most of this will fund projects that are not on tribal lands. Segerstrom says that while more would be better, 10 billion is a meaningful investment. The bill would have a decipherable, identifiable, meaningful impact on conservation stewardship, unquote. Quote again, this bill represents a landscape level investment. Quote, we'd like to do more, but 10 billion is a lot, unquote, said Joe Neguse. Quote again, when you think about the massive investment that 10 billion represents, you're literally talking about hundreds of thousands of people working on these projects back here in Colorado and across the country. And so proponents of the plan also see Climate Conservation Corps as a chance to make amends for the racism and sexism that permeated the New Deal program. Although the CCC had a quota of 10% African Americans, which would have been in proportion to the population in the late 1930s, the quota was often not met, despite African American unemployment at the time being higher than white unemployment. Camps for CCC men were segregated by race, and women were ineligible for the program. Biden's plan set aside funding for tribal and native communities, including $500 million for tribal drinking water infrastructure repairs. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, the nation's first Native American cabinet secretary, said in her confirmation hearings that Biden's Civilian Climate Corps plan, quote, demonstrates that America's public lands can and should be engines for clean energy production, adding that a 21st century Corps, quote again, has the potential to spur job creation. And Robles emphasized the need for water and electricity infrastructure on tribal lands, but also pointed out a need for funding to preserve important cultural sites. Quote, many of these projects are not able to be completed in a year, but rather take multiple years, decades, or generations to complete. We will need to take a long-term approach to ensure that these are successful for generations to come, unquote. To Joe Neguse, the Climate Corps can represent a paradigm shift on how Americans may think about government, unquote. Or I should say, quote, I imagine that this could be sort of a new construct for the future as we talk about large-scale projects we'd like to bring federal resources to bear. So, that certainly is a good piece of the bill. As I said, it might have to be expanded by 10 times, by 30 times. It needs more money. Okay, I did not check, on this occasion, but I'd recommend going to berniesanders.com and see how much he allocated in his plan for something like a new climate corps. I'm sure such an idea, or an idea very like it, was somewhere in his plan, and it would be interesting to make the comparison. If I have a little extra time tonight, I will pull that up and see what that actually brings to light. So, our next piece is from Common Dreams, as well. It has to do with someone quite popular among us. Quote, "The time is now to go forward," unquote. Sanders says Dems can't waste time catering to obstructionist GOP. This one is by Jake Johnson, and was done on April 11th. And there's Bernie motioning to correspondent, speaks with reporters on the Senate subway on Tuesday, and of course gesturing, actually conducting the orchestra, which is the way he does his speeches. He sort of conducts the orchestra, does it in rhythm. Senator Bernie Sanders, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, said Saturday that amid the immediate emergencies of climate change, COVID-19, mass unemployment, and homelessness, congressional Democrats cannot afford to dampen their infrastructure ambitions in the hopes of winning support from obstructionist Republicans. Quote, "The time is now to go forward. This country faces enormous crises that have got to be addressed right now. When you have 500,000 people who are homeless, I'm not going to slow down," unquote. You quote again, "When the scientists tell us we have 5 or 6 years before there will be irreparable damage done because of climate change," the Vermont senator added, quote, "I'm not going to slow down," unquote. Sanders' remarks, I almost said Berner's remarks, came as the Democratic leadership is weighing how to proceed with the roughly $2.3 trillion infrastructure package President Joe Biden unveiled last month, a proposal that will serve as a starting point for congressional negotiations. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said she hopes to pass infrastructure legislation by July. But unified Republican opposition to the package and growing complaints from conservative deficit scolds within the Democratic caucus, guess that must be Mark Warner, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and maybe Angus King, and maybe a few others, are threatening to impede work on the package the progressives hope to transform into a sprawling bill that deals with a wide range of priorities, from climate to affordable housing to prescription drug prices. On Monday, the Senate parliamentarian gave Democrats a green light to use the filibuster-proof budget, the reconciliation process, for additional spending legislation this year, granting the party the option to move ahead with an infrastructure measure without Republican support. Sanders told the Post that he's preparing to use the reconciliation tool, but Chuck Schumer, Majority Leader of the Senate, has not publicly committed to that strategy as the Biden administration continues to hold out for a bipartisan compromise. With the legislative filibuster in place, Senate Democrats would need the support of at least 10 Republicans to pass an infrastructure bill through the regular order of the Senate. And I guess I have to add here, there's no way they would get the support of at least 10 of the Republicans for what they mean by an infrastructure bill. 10 Republicans might support a bill that was about roads and bridges, and that's all, but they won't support one that's about the water systems and about the care economy. They probably won't even support one that's about having broadband for everybody in the country. So if they do get that kind of infrastructure bill, a very narrow one, roads, okay, and bridges, I don't know what the Democrats will do. Okay, I don't know whether they will hold out and say, no, it's not going to be this narrow a bill. We're not passing any piece of crap. We want something that solves problems across the board. Either that or get rid of the filibuster so we can have up and down votes. One or the other. But you don't get both anymore. Quote, the president believes there's a path forward to get this American Jobs Plan passed with bipartisan support. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said during a Thursday briefing, can we really believe anything she says? Well, maybe that was strictly true. Maybe that is what the president believes, but not what she believes. But I doubt it's even what the president believes. He's just trying. I think he's just kind of playing politics. He knows under Mitch that there's no possibility that any of the Republicans are actually going to join. But there's a strategy he's following too. That strategy is if they don't join and he goes for a reconciliation bill, not only will the Republicans be cut out of having a say over that bill, but they will be on record as voting against it. Every Republican in the Senate will go on record as voting against it because Mitch will make them do that. And if they all vote against it, and that bill is a great success, guess which party is going to have a sweep in 2022? This is in part about the politics of the matter. He didn't want to immediately jump on having a reconciliation bill for sure, because he wanted to play politics with the Republicans for a while. And he's going through with that. He's having bipartisan meetings in the White House at this point to try to get the bipartisan support. So we see him seeing people and talking it up and talking up support. We don't see him just trying to push through the bill. There's something to be said for this, but we also have to say it's dangerous. We don't know for how many months Democrats are going to have a 51-50 margin in the Senate. 1 month can change it. We can have an elderly senator who gets sick and decides to retire, to leave the Senate. Okay, or God forbid, dies. And if that senator is from a state that has a Republican governor, we could have a Republican senator quickly appointed, changing the majority in the Senate. Then all Biden will ever get from the Republicans is a stone wall until the election of 2022. So I think it's risky. What he's doing is risky. Anyway, progressive lawmakers have cautioned the Biden administration against weakening an infrastructure package they believe is already insufficient in a likely futile effort to win over Republican lawmakers who unanimously voted against a broadly popular $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package last month. And Representative Jayapal, Democrat of Washington, said, quote, "Let's not water down a bill for a party that's not actually interested in bipartisanship or wait for Republicans to have some awakening on climate change," unquote. She, who was the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, said earlier this month, quote, "Let's move with the urgency and boldness this moment calls for. And with the haste, I might add, that this moment calls for." In a report released on Thursday, Adam Hirsch of the University of Massachusetts Amherst and also Mark Paul of the New College of Florida argued that underspending in response to the current crises risks long-term damage to the economy and the climate, a warning progressives cited. There's all the more reason to quickly push ahead with an ambitious recovery package. There's Jayapal tweeting, "Now is the time to go big." And economists warn Democrats going too small on infrastructure risks. The cost of inaction outweigh the risks of borrowing to take action by trillions of dollars. That was from an article by Common Dreams. In an appearance on MSNBC Saturday, Bernie said that Republican lawmakers are, quote, "probably not, quote unquote, going to accept arguments in support of big spending on climate solutions, core infrastructure, caregiving, and more." Quote, "They live in their world, and their world will be trying to obstruct as much as possible what Biden and many of us in the Congress are trying to do," unquote, Sanders said, arguing that the GOP's top priority is trying to divide us up by stressing xenophobia, racism, and making it harder for people to vote. And People for Bernie tweeted at Ali Velshi, "It's a compelling argument on infrastructure. Are any Republicans going to buy that argument that you just made?" That was a quote, okay, from Ali Velshi. And Bernie answered, "Probably not." Ever the realist, Bernie Sanders. And he said, "Our job is to rally the American people around an agenda that works for workers and the middle class who have been neglected for so many years. It is the right thing to do policy-wise. It is the right thing to do politically," unquote. And of course, he was right about that. There's lots more on climate. I'll probably do some more tomorrow. All kinds of things are going on. But now I wanted to shift to the minimum wage debate. Since we are getting on, there seem to be developing two sides to this particular debate, or at least there are two sides taking on each other. So let's take a look at the arguments offered by each of the sides. First, a piece from the Economic Policy Institute, from their blog, okay, the Working Economics blog. And this is an article written by David Cooper and Lawrence Michel. Perry, longtime writer for the Economics Policy Institute. This was posted on April 5th, and they say, or the headline says, calls to establish a regional adjusted federal minimum wage are dangerously misguided. We need to raise the federal minimum wage. Its deterioration value over the past 5 decades has exacerbated poverty, widened inequality, and lowered wages to the bottom third of wage earners, despite the fact that these workers are typically older and have more education than their counterparts a generation ago. Then they jump to critiques of the effort to raise the minimum wage to $15. They don't ask the obvious question. If the proper way to go is a single minimum wage but for the whole country, as opposed to a set of regional minimum wages, then why has the value of the federal minimum wage so drastically deteriorated over the past 5 decades? Well, we know why it has. It's because it was easy for people to postpone actually raising the minimum wage, because they could always say, well, we have this minimum wage, which is the floor, but if things get expensive in any of the individual states, they're always free to pass a minimum wage that exceeds our minimum wage, which on the surface seems fine and fair, but you cannot isolate the states. And that is to say, when states raise their minimum wage, they have to worry about competition from other states. So when you say that the increase in the minimum wage is going to be up to actions within the states and to politics inside the states, and this goes on inside of a system where states are being encouraged by corporations to compete with one another by holding down the minimum wage, you then do not get a system where the minimum wage is keeping up with the cost of living in high-cost states, because those high-cost states still need to attract businesses. And the way they do it is by taking it out of the hides of the wage earners, keeping the wages actually low. So that is one critique of the single minimum wage for the whole country. But anyway, let me continue with this particular piece. One misguided critique of the effort to raise the federal minimum to $15 in 2025 is that there is a need to establish a regional adjusted federal minimum wage set to local conditions. In fact, the federal minimum wage policy has always provided for tailored standards by coupling a strong national wage floor. Only it hasn't been a strong national wage floor. The last time the minimum wage was raised to $7.25 an hour, that wasn't a strong national wage floor. It wasn't a living wage all over the United States, even back in 2009. And now, it's 12 years later. It's a veritable scandal. Anyway, going on. Our wage floor can't believe they said has always provided for tailored standards by coupling a strong national wage floor with the ability for cities and states to adopt higher standards. They have little ability to do that in a very competitive environment. Our ability to set a national wage floor is much easier now than it was decades ago when lawmakers last raised the federal minimum to new heights. In 1968, when the federal minimum wage was lifted to its highest value in U.S. history and coverage of the law was vastly expanded, there were much larger differences in wage levels throughout the country. Yet, we now have empirical evidence that establishing this unprecedented nationwide minimum wage did not have adverse employment impacts. Yeah, that's true. It would be great if we could raise the minimum wage, not simply to $15 an hour, but to something that's a living wage for the whole country, all over the country. But politically, we can't, because the opponents to raising the minimum wage now talk about how raising it to a living standard would result in huge losses of businesses in various low-wage, low-cost states because their small businesses could not stay in business, and they used this scare talking point again and again and again. And so it's been very hard to raise the minimum wage. It's been very hard to get nationwide pressure for a rise in the minimum wage, which can get through the political system with its overrepresentation of rural and low-cost states in the Senate, because there are 2 senators for every state, no matter how small a population the state is. So you all realize how this works. There's a rural bias, there's a low-cost bias, there's a low-wage bias in terms of the Senate, in terms of what people support. They look at their state and they say, well, in our state, $7.25 is not so bad. Well, maybe it should be raised. Maybe it should be raised to 11 or $12.50 or something like that. But $15 is just too high. Meanwhile, 2020 to 2025 passed by, and by 2025, the people in the more costly states need $25 an hour, not $15 an hour. They're still $10 an hour behind, which is even further behind than where they started in, let's say, in 2020, when they were at $7.25. That is to say, between $7.25 and $15 is close to $8, but between $15 an hour and $25 an hour, there's a $10 difference. So the difference between the actual minimum wage and what people need will have grown by more dollars an hour than the difference now that exists between $15 an hour and $7.25. So, and this is really ridiculous. It's continual catch up with the distance between a living wage and what's even proposed to be the minimum wage growing larger. Here's a section that says, I'm surprised that the Economic Policy Institute is saying this. A $15 an hour 2025 is an appropriate level for the federal minimum wage. The $15 minimum wage in 2025 would be an appropriate and economically manageable level for the national wage floor. Data from EPI's Family Budget Calculator, which compiles the typical costs of basic necessities throughout the country, showed that by 2022, there is not a county in the United States where an individual working full-time year-round could achieve a secure standard of living earning less than $15 per hour. Well, I certainly agree. But the question here is not whether by 2022 they could achieve a secure standard of living earning less than $15 an hour. It's whether they could achieve a secure standard of living earning $15 an hour by 2022. We don't even know that. And certainly by 2025, we don't know that. We're about to experience supposedly a booming economy. And we don't know whether the booming economy, which generally is going to be good, is going to be good for poorer people living through a period where there's a little more inflation than we've had for some time. Moreover, $15 an hour in 2025 is the equivalent of $13.79 in today's dollars. You wish. You don't know that. Your projection model has to be good enough to project from $13.75, in today's dollars, to $15 in 2025. Taking the federal minimum to this level would be an increase of about 30% above the 1968 peak, when the minimum wage was worth the equivalent of $10.59 in today's dollars. So, in other words, they're taking into account only inflation. But over the past 50 years, the value of goods and services produced from each hour of work in the economy has more than doubled. The minimum wage should be set at a level that ensures all workers, including those in the lowest paid jobs, benefit from the economy's increased capacity to generate income, particularly when low-wage workers tend to have higher levels of education than their counterparts during the 1960s. The argument that it would be better to adapt the federal minimum wage to local conditions is described as avoiding the one-size-fits-all policy imposed on states regardless of local conditions. That is a mischaracterization of federal policy, however, since there's a wide variation in minimum wages across states and localities where states permit, as subnational governments adopt higher standards. The purpose of federal law is to set a national floor which provides a living wage to all workers and brings wages in lower wage states closer to those in higher wage areas. I can certainly agree, and I fully agree with the idea that the national floor has to provide a living wage to all workers, but let's see that truly happen. I think that to do that even now in 2021, it would be necessary to take the lowest wage area in the United States, set that at $15 an hour, and then cost adjust the minimum wage for all higher cost areas across the United States. And I'm talking about the local areas, and automatically cost adjust the size of the living wage in that way to keep pace with the differences in CPI across the country. It is critically important that the federal standard not be set to normalize or tolerate existing low-wage conditions in particular regions, industries, or occupations that are largely the result of historical racism and sexism. When the first federal minimum wage was being debated in the 1930s, Southern congressmen strongly opposed the federal standard, concerned that it would upset the white supremacist plantation system that dominated the South's economy. Indeed, the Southern lawmakers insisted the federal wage standard should be adjusted by region to account for differences in costs of living. What ultimately led to the minimum wage law's passage of the single national wage floor was a compromise with Southern Democrats to exempt agriculture, restaurants, and a host of other service sector industries that disproportionately employed black workers, of course, so they could earn less. Even after it was amended in 1967 to cover more of these industries, the law still exempted most farm workers, who today are majority Latinx, and allowed employers to pay a sub-minimum wage to tipped workers, who today are overwhelmingly women. Then he argues adjusting the federal minimum wage based upon regional wage differences would serve to cement racial and gender wage disparities. Indeed, when we last analyzed the proposal to regionally adjust the federal minimum wage, we found black workers would be particularly harmed, and women of color were a disproportionate share of those left behind relative to a federal minimum wage without any regional adjustments. I'm not sure what they did in that particular article. Okay, quickly scanning that. Okay, it seems to me that their calculations are based on a model. In fact, they had to be. This particular fact sheet was done on March 5th of 2019. So it couldn't have taken account of what's happened during COVID and what may happen now with the growing influx of money coming into the economy. So I'm not at all sure their calculations here are relevant to our current situation. They would have to justify that for me to take it really seriously. But they may be right. I will go over it and check it out. But the argument against having a situation where regional adjustments would work to the detriment of certain groups and genders is to just come up with a minimum wage, as I said. That was a living wage, a true living wage for the lowest cost areas in the United States. And then cost adjust based on differences in the CPI for all, the other areas. As costs increased in the lower CPI areas of the country, the minimum wage would automatically be scaled up from year to year. In other words, it wouldn't have to remain the same. If it was set in 2021, it won't have to remain the same in 2022, 2023, 2024. We could use the CPI scaling to constantly raise the minimum wage in all of the areas. We could index the amount to the CPI changes. So I think that's pretty much the argument, of EPI. I don't think I'm distorting it. They've done some nice analysis here. and it's good to look at what they have to say, but I think maybe they're wrong because I see them constantly talking about a minimum wage for the whole country, but I don't see them talking about a living wage. And I know from day one the costs of living are going to be different in going from local area to local area, across the United States. I don't think that states should have a role in setting the minimum wage. I think that's bad for people. I think we should use a more carefully developed sort of indicator like the CPI. If you don't like the CPI, then propose an alternative that happens to be a better indicator. But the point is, if it's done by indicator, we can be much more certain that the regional minimum wages will keep up with inflation in those areas compared to other areas. But let's next look at the opposing argument, the national minimum argument. This one's from the Washington Post. It says, a single national minimum wage makes no sense. This one was written by Roger Lowenstein, March 26, 2021. The federal minimum wage was enacted in 1938 after Franklin D. Roosevelt called for, quote, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, unquote. It was set at a Depression era, 25 cents per hour, and for a while it increased faster than the inflation rate. But the increases in real terms stopped with the Great Society. Since 1968, Congress has been miserly towards the country's lowest paid workers, and the minimum has lost 40% of its purchasing power. By the way around that, of course, as I said, is to look at the CPI changes from year to year, in all of the localities. If the CPI goes up in the lowest cost area in the day one, then the starting minimum wage is not going to be a living wage anymore. Then you do the CPI adjustment, it is then going to be a living wage. So it will be, if you do it right the first time, there will continue to be a fair day's pay for fair days the work. But so the minimum wage debates have inevitably gotten bogged down by the large regional differences in living costs. When Democrats bring back a proposal for a minimum wage hike, cut from the recent stimulus package by the parliamentarian in the Senate, no, really cut from the stimulus package by Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and 8 the senatorial Democrats. They could have overridden the opinion of the parliamentarian. It's just advice. It wasn't cut by the parliamentarian. It was cut by the freaking Democrats. This would be smarter economics and smarter politics. It would appeal to centrist Democrats, some of whom are uneasy about across-the-board jump to $15 an hour, and potentially to Republicans. And a regionally adjusted minimum would do less harm to the poorest parts of the country. Many states have their own minimums, but this federalist approach is broken. 21 states do not set minimums above the federal floor of $7.25 an hour, which was last raised in 2009. Since then, adjusted for inflation, that wage has lost 1/5 of its purchasing power. While the stock market has tripled, even in most richer states, the legal minimum has fallen far below its traditional ratio to market wages. Economists say the federal minimum should be a guarantee, a floor for states, but I'm unwilling to go higher. Congress hasn't touched the issue since 2007, when it mandated the 2009 increase, principally because any minimum wage has trade-offs. It creates both positive and negative effects. High minimums increase wages for those working at or near the baseline. They improve worker morale and productivity and reduce turnover and training expenses. On the other hand, when minimums rise above a certain threshold, they result in job losses and lower profits, including for small businesses struggling in the pandemic. Employers pass along some of the higher labor costs to their customers. And many of these, such as in Walmart and McDonald's, are also low income. The CBO forecasts that raising the national minimum to $15 over several years would deliver $333 billion more in wages to low-paid Americans, but that's a net gain, the result of a positive $509 billion more to those employed, and a negative $175 billion less because of 1.4 million lost jobs. Similarly, the CBO says a $15 an hour minimum would modestly increase the federal deficit through a combination of costs and savings. When economists talk about the minimum wage, they envision a sweet spot or a range that best accommodates these trade-offs. But the sweet spot is drastically different across the country. It even varies within states. Chicago's living costs are 35% higher than those in Danville, in East Central Illinois, according to the Pew Research Center. Nationally, the variations are greater. The cost of living in Manhattan is 3 times that in Joplin, Missouri. The biggest variant is housing, but it isn't the only one. The average cost of a chicken sandwich in Bakersfield, California is $5.73, compared with $3.07 in Findlay, Ohio. While there is no consensus on the ideal minimum, economists have a useful heuristic for determining a reasonable level. Many suggest 50 to 60% of either the median or average hourly wage, but hourly wages also show sharp regional variations. Any wage that would satisfy workers in San Francisco would be untenable in West Virginia, asked Joe Manchin. Any wage that protected jobs in West Virginia would be meaningless for workers in Boston. And as Arindrajit Dubey, the University of Massachusetts economist, argued in 2017, quote, a one-size-fits-all approach creates avoidable trade-offs, unquote. Most economists agree that small increases in the minimum have not historically resulted in significant job losses. The rub comes when they try to define small. Michael Strain of the American Enterprise Institute has argued that $15 would wreck the economy. However, there's been some shift in the profession toward a more liberal stance. As recently as 2019, Dubé cautioned, quote, "We are currently witnessing minimum wage increases that go beyond our experience of the past few decades. Uh, we are witnessing minimum wage increases, that go beyond our experience of the past few decades," unquote. Last month, he argued that the CBO estimate of job losses at $15 was significantly overstated. Several states, including Florida, have legislated paths to $15. So much of the debate over job losses is concerned with service jobs because those are generally the lowest paid. To some extent, such jobs are protected because you cannot move them. If you live in Pennsylvania, you cannot order a hamburger in Mississippi. But such positions are vulnerable to labor-saving shortcuts. A restaurant can decide to order pre-cut vegetables instead of hiring someone to slice them. Or it can dismiss its waitstaff and serve customers at a counter. There is conflicting evidence about the effect on service jobs in Seattle, which in 2014 passed a gradual rise in its minimum to $15. Overall, some 46 cities and counties have the local minimums above state levels, most of them in California. Unlike service jobs, factory jobs, tradables can be moved around. Economists left and right, from Harvard's Lawrence Katz to AEI's Strain, say that at a $15 minimum, low-end factory jobs in the lowest wage states will be threatened by overseas labor. That would increase potential job losses, particularly in poorer states. A higher minimum could act like an internal tariff, eroding the competitive advantage of such states. Quote, "There are losers in any minimum wage policy," unquote, says Mark Zandi, chief economist, at Moody's Analytics, who favors going to $15 an hour nationally by 2025. If the wage he sets too high, he adds, the losers are the poorest workers in the poorest areas, regions. The impasse has resulted in a policy of doing nothing. As of December, the average hourly wage in the United States was $25.15 an hour. That would suggest a minimum wage of $12.58. Only 6 states and Washington, D.C. have enacted a minimum of at least $12.50. Seems to me we should have $12.50 but tomorrow, an average hourly wage at a minimum of $12.58 but tomorrow. That would certainly be a big improvement over what we have now, and put in an indexing formula for each year thereafter. However, I don't really advocate for that. What I advocate for is, as I said, you go in, you discover the lowest cost area of the United States and what a living wage is in that particular area. Then you adjust in every other area of the United States, you upwardly adjust from that particular lowest cost area to all the other areas of the United States based on differences in the CPI. When the year changes, what you do is you again take the lowest cost area in the United States and take that as the baseline. You calculate what a living wage is in that particular area, and you use that again to scale everything. And every year you do the same thing. And so that's going to ensure that every local area inside the United States has a minimum wage, which is a living wage. So I think the argument here between these two sides would have been an easier argument if people just stuck to the idea that in the lowest cost area of the United States, there needs to be a living wage to begin with. That is the foundation of any increase, okay, in the minimum wage. And you cost adjust, okay, accordingly. You cost adjust based on an indicator that doesn't have anything to do with governors, doesn't have anything to do with senators, but doesn't have anything to do with anything. It only has to do with the actual CPI calculations. Okay? In other words, once you pass this once, it's not a political thing afterwards, or at least it largely could be kept out, okay, of politics. But I still have some more to say. Okay? In other words, you could have a minimum wage which at once is national and also localized. It would be national because determined by a national formula and based on a living wage. But I don't actually believe in either of the two sides. And the reason why I don't is because I think it would be far better if we ignored the minimum wage bill entirely and instead passed, as part of the infrastructure plan, passed a job guarantee for Americans. And where we set the minimum wage is in the context of the job guarantee. Again, we go to the lowest cost area, okay, in the United States. We calculate what a living wage is there. That becomes the job guarantee wage for that particular locality. Then we scale up for every other locality inside of the United States. That means there will be a living wage in every local area in the United States that is nationally determined and federally funded, because since anybody can get a job in the job guarantee when they desire to do so, if anybody tries to pay them less and has a worse package of fringe benefits than the federal job guarantee program does, they'll just take a job with the federal job guarantee program every time so they can have a living wage. So that's the way to guarantee a living wage and guarantee a job at the same time, because you get a de facto living wage and it's cost adjusted across the whole country. So that's what I favor, and I hope that you favor that too. So there we are. I am done for tonight. Hey, Terry, how are you? Terry Burke is here. So let me go back to the beginning. And Carmen says, I'm done. Nice to see you too, Bonnie and Joe. This is 9:07. Kay says, Evelina, are you here? Bonnie says, hi, everyone. Carmen says, I like the climate emergency upgrade term. Carmen says, hi, hostess with the mostess, and smiles. I think that's you, Bonnie. Kay says, shared. Ghost Start says, John Sullivan, Trump/Biden's Russian ambassador. There used to be a heavyweight champion by the name of John L. Sullivan. He used to walk into bars, supposedly, and say, I can lick any man in the house. Lana says, howdy at 9:17. And Kay says, Kevin Camps was on Hartman the other day. He's a nuclear specialist. He was saying Japan wants to dump the rest of its wastewater into the Pacific soon because of the Olympics they are having there later this year. Not at all good. I think we need to yank the Olympics away from them for that. Of course, they might just dump the wastewater into the Pacific just like this anyway. Carmen says coronavirus was actually helping the environment some. Hadn't seen a wildlife return, but during the lockdown, since I was a kid in Europe. And Aaron says, hi all. Hello, Aaron. And Biden says, Biden gives new fake date to end fake war in Afghanistan to 9/11. The 20th anniversary caused climate change? Yeah, probably, somewhat. And Carmen says, red, California is getting the worst drought ever this year, and that's where most of our food comes from. Garstadt said, oh yeah, I forgot. He says, we can't pull out for the women. And Lana says, go start, silly ass. And spells ass, $, S. Garstadt says, thanks, Lana. I'll be here all night. Kay says, love Jaya Powell. Terry Burke says, hi, sorry, late. Kay says, in 1995, when I moved to the then blue state of North Carolina, my first job paid $10 an hour. Ghostart says, 20 years isn't a war. It's an occupation. Yes, it is. Anna says, I agree, Ghostart, occupation. Ghostart says, Biden administration resume private property seizures for border wall construction today. Kay says, however, when I worked for the regular discount stores, or maybe it's regional discount stores, it went back to minimum. But when I went to work for Walmart, they said they paid me $11 an hour, but I think there was wage theft going on there too. Probably. Kay says, we need the PRO Act. The more unions would fix this. And Kay says, the federal job guarantee is a great idea. Now, this is strange. Okay, it's saying I can't pick up any comments from Facebook groups and Facebook profiles that they're not actually being picked up on my chat feed. Interesting. Okay, looks like I'm about done for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll have a bunch of other interesting things for you. Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks a lot for staying. Thanks for your comments. I'll see you tomorrow night at roughly same time, same station. You may have noticed that I've been focusing on items that are not simply current. Like I haven't been covering the protests as a result of the murder in Minneapolis, the latest murder. I haven't covered also some other current things. I wanted to focus on two very important but longer term issues for this program. So I hope you like that. And I'll see you tomorrow. We love you too, Kay. Thank you. Yeah, those protests are heartbreaking because it doesn't look like anything. Well, of course, the officer is now gone, and the police chief is now gone. What else will be done to change the situation? I don't know. Carmen says, good, thorough material and topics. Thanks for the quality, Knight. Thank you, Carmen.